What I'd like to show you today is kind of a walkthrough of how I would develop certain images that I've made. So what you see in front of you here in Lightroom 5 is a grid of some images that I've included that I use in my courses to show the before and after of my work in Lightroom. These are some of the ones I've included here. But really what I want to show is this particular image because it's come up in conversation, and then if there's time I'll move on to another one. So the first thing I do is, first of all, I'm in the library, and if I want to look at that image alone, I can go down and hit fit, and it'll show me the whole image. One-to-one allows me to zoom in on the image, draws a little bit of a preview here, so it takes a second or two. And you can see that there's a lot of detail in this raw shot. This, by the way, is a DNG, a digital negative, that was converted from the camera raw. And this shows the after of what I did to the image. And what I want to do is switch over to the develop module here. And I'm going to also make a virtual copy of this image, which is Lightroom's way of giving us a second version of this image. So again, this is the one that I did do my development on. So I'm going to make a virtual copy first under Photo menu, create virtual copy, or if you're a quick key guy like me, you hit Command apostrophe. So now I've made a virtual copy. You can always tell when you've got a virtual copy because when you hover over it, or if you've got your previews showing larger, you'll see this little page turn on the corners here. And so the virtual copies have the little page turn on the corner, or dog ear, and the regular non-virtual copies do not. And I just accidentally shut off my thumbnail. There we go. So here's the virtual copy, and what I'm going to do is take that virtual copy, move things down a little bit here, and I'm going to reset all of the development so you can see how that image came out of the camera. I'm going to go back with my Command Z, which is my undo, and I'm going to show you the development, and then I'm going to reset it. So you can see a couple things happen when I hit reset. First of all, the image gets a lot less contrasty. It gets a little weak. There's also a bit of distortion caused by my ultra-wide angle lens. And I want to remove some of these problems, and I also want to increase the contrast in the sky. Even though I used a polarizer to eliminate as much reflection as I could to be able to see my subject in the water, I still want to add a little bit more contrast and punch up detail here. I mean, all in all, this is an adequate photograph, and back in the days of film, this would have been pretty much what they ran in the magazine. They might have added a little bit of contrast somewhere in pre-production, but we have a lot more tools than they did, so we're going to take advantage of them. So people always ask me, what do you do first? Well, the first thing is I go from the top down, most of the time. The only exception to that is that I like to see what lens corrections I can make first, because sometimes clicking the Enable Profile Corrections will dial in the camera and lens that you used and begin to show you a little bit better image. So I'm going to click on Enable Profile Corrections, and did you see that jump there? Okay, here's without and here's with. What it does is it looks at the lens profile, which I'll show you right here, is my Canon. This one says it's a PowerShot G12. So that's the camera I used, a little compact camera, and it's noticing that it's how it works that way. So it applies some correction to the inherent distortion in that camera. So we're not talking about a big professional SLR. We're talking about a point and shoot, although it's a professional one. It does a pretty good job of capturing my scene there. So going back to the basics, first thing I do is I look at color temperature. Now, I like my images a little warm. Now we get a lot of cooler tones in the Pacific Northwest. Often our pictures will come out kind of bluish like this from all the ultraviolet and blue reflection in the sky. So I like to go a little bit warmer. It just seems to be a little bit more attractive to the human eye to see things in the warmer tones. And exposure-wise, I would say, if anything, this image is just slightly overexposed. But I don't really want to play too much with exposure until I try to punch up the contrast a bit. And by the way, anything that I do, I can undo. So if I start to move sliders and I decide, wow, I really want to undo what I just did, you can double click and that will reset it to 0. As we go forward, I would like to add a little bit of contrast to this image, but I have to be careful. If I add too much contrast, I might blast out the whites. So sometimes I'll open up my histogram and I'll see where my histogram is, and this tells me that my highlights at this end of the histogram are not quite slamming up against the edge. There's still some printable detail in here. But when I do my corrections, especially exposure, I always want to see what's going on here. If I open up exposure, I have to make sure that I'm not going to be literally blasting out pixels that are informational here. So I'm going to move that back to 0 by double-clicking it. And I'm adding a little bit of contrast, keeping in mind that I don't want to overly blast out. The other way that I do this, and often I jump down to clarity, is I'll put clarity somewhere around 10. And what that's doing is it's boosting the contrast in the midtones. So midtones would be like the sand, the barnacles, the rocks. It doesn't mean this area here, and it doesn't mean the deep shadows over here and over here. So with a little bit of clarity added, I'm going to swing it up pretty high so you just see how that crisps up and punches up the image. If I go too high and I'm not viewing my image at full size, now I have got it at full size by just clicking down, you can sometimes overdo clarity and you end up with this weird edge here that happens. So I don't want to add too much of that, so I'm going to keep it down around 10. And I'm going to also just go back to lens corrections here and see whether I can also add color, remove chromatic aberrations. See this greenish tint here? Right on the edge of the rocks, there's a little greenish line. Sometimes you'll see a pink or purple or greenish line. I can hit remove chromatic aberrations and it pretty much eliminates it right off the bat. If you want to go closer, even more than 1:1, you can set Lightroom to go to any other magnification, such as 2:1. That's double. You're looking at actual pixels here, and you're going to see some of the flaws in any camera lens if you go up to double like that. So we'll see areas that are well detailed, and we'll see areas that are not. I'm just kind of pushing around here. So I never really go up that high unless I just need to see whether or not my profile correction is working. So again, remove chromatic aberration. Works very, very well on this image. I'm going to go back to fill or fit so we can see the whole image. And I want to continue forward with my development. So the next thing I do is I say, okay, you have to always verbalize in your mind what it is you want to achieve. Well, one thing is I might want to remove some of the distraction caused by this area here, and that can be done by cropping, or I can remove some of the color manually so that I don't have that distraction. The way I would do it in the latter way is I would take this adjustment brush. Again, I'm going to close these panels so you can just see where I am. It's right above basics, and these are adjustments you can make locally versus globally. All of the basic adjustments, tone curve, everything below here is global, meaning it does everything to the whole image. These are local adjustments. If I take the adjustment brush, it has all of these tools within it. This is the size of the adjustment brush here, feather, which is the soft edge or feathered edge of the adjustment brush, and the flow, meaning the intensity of what that brush will achieve. What I'm going to be doing here is removing saturation with a small brush to be able to get into that little tight spot. I'm going to remove saturation to the color here so this individual doesn't drag my eye to it with this yellow arm. I'm just going to go to saturation and go to nearly nothing. And as you can see, I'm just painting over this individual and I've got it pretty painted in now. And when I go back to turning off the adjustment brush, you can see that the yellow sleeve is now gone. If I want to do further edits in adjustment brush, I simply highlight the tool again, it drops down its tool drawer, and if I hover over my image, I'll see where I last did any adjustments. Once I click on that, it shows you here are the available adjustments. These are what I've made, and I can go and change my adjustments just like that. So anytime you re-enable your adjustment, you can make any changes you want. You can lower the exposure. So see, I can dim him down and make that person almost disappear. Leave this tool now and go to some of the juicier things that I really want to do, which is I want to make the starfish a little bit more contrasty, and I want to capture back some detail in the sky without losing the people. My favorite way of doing that locally is to use the gradient filter. I'm going to hover over it so you see the name pop up. Graduated filter, they're calling it. You can call it graduated or gradient, it's the same thing. The way this works is you want to go from a starting point to a finishing point by dragging the filter's length. And I'm going to start up at the top of the sky because I want to begin my effect there. And I drag down till I'm just past the area that I want to fix, which in this case is the sky. Now nothing's happening yet, except it's taken all the color out because the last move I made with any adjustment was to lower saturation. So you have a choice of resetting the graduated tools, or you can accept whatever the last thing that was done is and then just change it back. The way to do that is you can hold down your Option key or Alt key on a PC, and you can reset all of the tools before you start using it. So what I'm going to do is lower exposure in that gradient. Now watch what happens. As I lower exposure, see how the sky darkens? But I also want to up the contrast. So I'm lowering exposure and upping the contrast, and I want to capture back the highlights by dragging the highlight slider to the left. If I go too far, it'll turn this whites grayish. See, I'm all the way down to 0 or 100, minus 100. It gets grayish, so I don't want to use that too high. I'd rather up the contrast and lower the exposure just a bit. The other thing you can do is add a little bit of clarity. So right now I've got a nice punched up sky. Doesn't look too fake. I always want to keep it looking somewhat realistic. And you can always play with these sliders again. So that's the first gradient. I can move that gradient deeper or shallower, but keep in mind the gradient's also applying these changes to everything in its path, including the tops of the rocks, the people. So one of the things I might do to correct for the darkening of the tops of these rocks is open up shadows a bit in that gradient. And now I've recaptured some of the detail that's back up in the rocks here. Yet I'm still getting my needs met with the sky. Another thing I want to do is add a second gradient to the bottom. So I'm going to start from the bottom this time. Now, I know that these same changes are going to automatically be enabled when I start dragging my gradient from the bottom north, or bottom to the top. And if I want to make sure that my gradient goes perfectly vertical, I can hold down the Shift key and it will constrain my gradient drag to perfectly vertical. Same thing works with perfectly horizontal or at a perfect 45. So here's the gradient that I drew, but in my opinion it's just too dark. So it's using the same settings I had done with this gradient. All I need to do is back off of those settings. I don't really need to use the highlight slider anymore. I don't really need to increase the shadow detail, but I do want to add contrast and maybe a little bit of clarity. So right away that punches up the color tone and the detail in these starfish. And if I go to one-to-one view, and then I'm going to, since I'm in a tool, I can't really scroll around that easily while I'm in the tool unless I hold down the space bar with my thumb and move it around, or I can enable the navigator right there. Whoops, double clicked it too fast. And now I can move around in my image with the navigator. I want to go down and look at this starfish because I don't want to overdo my development of the starfish. So there it is. I still have my gradient or graduated filter enabled. You can tell because it's lit up and its tool set is visible. And now I'm going to add a little bit of sharpness. So I've got a little bit of clarity, some sharpness. I can not worry about shadow detail. Exposure I can play with here, but exposure looks pretty good right about where it is. Again, I can double click it if I want to neutralize it. You always have that chance. So that's pretty good detail. That's what I wanted. And now I'm going to go back to fit. And I pretty much got what I want here. I can always go back to the other gradient simply by clicking on its visible presence here, kind of a telltale tool. But if I were to go off of my image with my cursor, you can see that those two little gradient hints disappear. So you have to hover over your image if you want to see where you used any of these localized tools. I'm going to go back to this one. I'm going to bring it down a little bit deeper and just leave it there. And that's really all I want to do to this image. I find everything else about it pretty pleasing. I could say that, yeah, if I went in here, navigate over here, these look a little bleached out. So just to show you how I would fix that, I'm going to go in here and I'm going to go back to the tool that we used before, but this time with a larger brush. This is the adjustment brush. And that's about how large I need that. There we go. Up the flow and the density, so I'm using this brush at full strength. And I'm just going to turn this back to 0 setting by holding down my Option or Alt key and hit reset. Now I'm going to be able to use the adjustment brush and lower the highlights a bit. And there's one more thing I need to point out to you. When you use this brush, you can turn on auto masking, and what it attempts to do is actually make a mask that just covers the area that you're trying to adjust without any overflow, because this is a big round soft edge brush, right? You can see it right here. And I know that I could easily add some of that same correction to the parts I don't want to, so I make sure that that's on auto mask, and I can show where I'm drawing that mask by clicking down here or hitting the O key. So as I paint now, you can see this red showing up. That's not actually colorizing my image, it's just showing me where the mask is. It's a red mask, a red telltale overlay. I can turn that off now that I know I've drawn my mask where I need it. Now the mask doesn't show unless I hover over the tool. And so I'm going to drag down highlights a little bit. And I can up the contrast a little bit and do clarity. So anyway, all I did is I corrected the blown out tones right there. So I'm done doing the local corrections. I'm going to zoom back down and take a look at my image and see if there's anything else I need to do, any sensor dust or anything that needs retouching out. But I don't see anything else that needs to be done. The last thing I would do, and sometimes I do this even first, but often I do it last, is I'll go and I'll look at the crop and decide whether I need to correct the horizon line to be straighter. I can do that manually when I select the crop tool by tilting it like that, or I can drag this bubble level right out of the same crop tool, and I can draw a straight line right across where I know the horizon should be, let go, and it automatically corrects for it. And once I disable, then I'm right back to where my image is. So that's the quick lesson on fixing this particular image. Again, I can revisit any tool a second time by just enabling the tool, hovering over, and choosing the gradient that I did before. Maybe I decide a little later on that, gee, you know, it could be punched up even a little bit more, and I can add contrast. And there's one other tool I want to show you before I go, just because we're on the subject of gradients, and that is you have the linear graduated filter, and you also have the circular graduated filter. Again, this is starting to assume that I want to use the last setting I did, so I'm going to hold down my Option or Alt on a PC, hit Reset, and I'm going to show you how this tool works. But I have to pre-think what I want. I want to brighten the center of this starfish. This is something I'm not going to really do to this image, but I just want to show you how it works. So I'm going to bring up the exposure just a little bit to pre-think what my move is, and then I'm going to drag my gradient outwards. Notice that it brightened up all the other parts of the image and left this as it was. That's because I need to decide whether I am inverting. So you get the inside or the outside. It defaults to the outside. So I'm going to invert the mask. And now any changes I make will only happen inside that circle. And of course I can change the feather, how hard or sharp or soft that circle is. So I really don't want to overexpose that. I might want to add a little contrast. I might want to brighten it up just a hair. You can easily overdo it, so take it slow. And that's pretty much it. So as you can see, that's a circular graduated filter. Uncheck that. And there we go. That's the finished image, and I think I'm done with the demo. Thanks for watching and listening. This is Dave Julian, over and out.